Just about, here we go. Okay, yes, no, it's still the morning. It's still the morning. So I'd like everybody to welcome Julian Harcourt from Greyafro. Julian is a relatively new chamber member, but has got fantastic credentials when it comes to marketing and definitely taking a product out to the marketplace. We've had quite a few conversations about this seminar, and really just trying to break this broad, big, fat subject of marketing into something a little bit more digestible and something which is going to be practical for you to take away. And he leads with this big question: what do my customers really think? And I think a lot of this with marketing is to keep taking yourself out of your own bubble into your client's shoes and understanding that relationship. So I'm delighted that Julian's going to contribute to here. If you do have any questions, I think they'll pop up in the chat box. And Julian, over to you. Enjoy your session.
Thank you very much indeed, Forbes, and good morning, everyone, wherever you are. As Forbes has said, I'm going to talk probably for the next sort of 30 to 40 minutes about an area that's very dear to my heart. So, what do your customers really think? And in a very challenging marketplace, spending the time and effort to kind of go and really master that, I think, is a really key thing. I will attempt to answer some questions at the end of the presentation, but because it's kind of me talking and attempting to sort of do multitasking, I think that's probably a bit much. So I'll kind of talk through what I've got and then attempt to answer some questions. Hopefully you can all see the screen. So in terms of kind of why are we here? So as I said, helping you to understand your customers, what they're thinking, why they're thinking it, how they're acting, all that kind of behavior. And the reason I think that's really important in business is that really the more that you know about your customers, the better decisions that you can make. It's kind of true of all businesses, however small and large. And in my experience, during tough times, this is even more important than normal. And I think if that doesn't convince you, there's also a point around your competition. So particularly in challenging times where if you're not taking the time and trouble to really get under the skin of what's motivating your customers' behaviors and ask them to kind of go and do stuff, then your competition will. And I think I probably know a few of you kind of who are here today. So hopefully you can attest the fact I'm a very friendly man, well, at least a moderately friendly man. And I was lucky enough to get a haircut this week. So rather than being grey afro, which was kind of somewhere out there up until the weekend, I've actually got a sparkly new haircut. So yay for me, and I'm quite happy to be seen in public. So in terms of the agenda, and again, just mindful of you guys all kind of sat on your laptops, iPads, phones, wherever you are, I'm going to try and sort of signpost this and keep it in sort of clear chunks so you can work it through. And it all sort of builds up to a crescendo as I work it through. So in terms of the three kind of core phases, I'm going to do a little bit around what do you know already about your customers, because you probably know more than you realize, and what would you like to know about them. Then we'll talk a little bit about the sort of interpretation. So having kind of pulled all that information together, how can you make best sense of it, and how can you sort of interpret what that tells you in terms of some sensible actions you can go and take. And then the final bit, which in any kind of form of sort of analysis, research, learning kind of part, what are you going to do as a result of it? Because spending some time working out that your customers have got a strong view on X or Y topics, great, but not massively helpful unless you can actually do something else with it. So before I kind of get into the sort of grist of the presentation, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about me. So as I said, I'm Julian Harcourt. I'm what I would now term as an experienced marketing professional, which is a polite way of saying I've been doing it for quite a long time. I think it's 30 or so years this year. My business, Greyafro Marketing, I set up really to specialize on marketing to older consumers. And by older consumers, I talk about sort of those over the age of 50. And additionally, I provide sort of senior marketing, head of marketing support to businesses where they might quite like to have a little bit of that sort of support from time to time, but the size and scale of the business doesn't necessitate having someone doing that kind of job on a full-time basis. So where they've got sort of junior staff, a bit of help, or someone's kind of doing it as a sort of side of desk kind of piece. And in terms of credentials, Forbes was very good enough to give me quite a build up there. That was quite nice. I must remember that for future occasions. So my background in the 30 years or so is In the latter part, I was head of marketing for Viking Cruises in the UK. I was head of CRM for Experian Consumer Services. And then prior to that, I spent a lot of time in a variety of marketing roles in finance. So the Royal Bank of Scotland, Santander, well, actually it was Abbey at the time, so that kind of dates me a little bit, and the Nationwide Building Society and Breaks Food Service, amongst others. And in terms of what I do, because obviously marketing is a broad discipline, and you've heard a little bit about some digital kind of aspects this morning, and I think again Forbes kind of talked about the sort of need to sort of zone in on areas. So for me, I'm really all about the insight into action kind of phase. So really the understanding your market, your customers, the opportunity, what kind of motivates them, then interpreting that by using kind of combinations of sources of information to kind of come up with views and opinions and what that's really kind of telling you, then forming plans, so marketing activity, whatever that might be, to go and communicate with that audience, and then crucially measuring, which I'll touch on at the end, because ultimately if you're going to spend time, effort and money on marketing activity, you need to be able to measure it, because if you don't do that, you're going to struggle. I'm also based in what I was going to say this morning is sunny New Malden. It isn't. It's kind of fairly wet, I'm sure, wherever you are. And I guess on the side, what I do is a little bit of sort of training and mentoring. So occasionally I'll do webinars and courses to help people understand the over 50s market. And then I'm also involved in some wider communities around aging and longevity. So ageism in the workplace, for example. So in terms of what do your customers really think, and why I'm hoping you'll stick with the course with me for the next sort of 30 minutes or so, I'm really going to focus on sort of giving you some practical helps, in terms of steps and things that you can follow. I just reiterate my knowledge is power point, because however you choose to take what I'll talk to you about today, the more that you've got a good understanding of that, the more that you can kind of inform decisions and be in a strong position. And I think in the case of many small businesses, actually, they're generally fairly comfortable or find a means to go and pay for, I don't know, web design, digital advertising, copywriting, sort of things that have a very clear output, but generally don't spend an awful lot of time, in my experience, around the sort of strategy and understanding part. And I just wanted to kind of leave this thought with you, which is actually, a little bit of time up front will actually help save you money and achieve better results, because the more you understand your customers and their motivation and kind of the opportunities in the marketplace, the more clearly you can tailor the product you're offering. And also, if you've got people who are working for you or you're engaging services, to brief them to get the best possible results, because quite often, if you're not crystal clear or people misinterpret things, cost and time can kind of come through. And this is a great way to kind of cover against that. So let's get into kind of who are your customers. And for the purposes of this morning, I'm going to just talk broadly about sort of business to consumer, so B2C and B2B. And really, from a characteristics point of view, depending on what kind of business you're running, you'll know quite a lot about them already. There'll be certain elements in terms of how you're trying to target, which will just be either sort of natural sort of faults of what you're doing or quite specific. So if you take the sort of business to consumer, where you're going to individuals and households at the end, well, actually, there's some things you will have. So you might know how old they are. You might know kind of location-wise where they are, what their sort of household composition is, what sort of level that they're spending with you, and possibly what they're spending kind of wider levels. You may have a sense of their interest and hobbies, and you may even have a bit of a view around attitudes. And that's not an exhaustive list, but there'll be a whole range of areas where you'll have information. And then if you talk about if your business is marketing to other businesses, well, actually, again, you'll have a view around that. So in terms of the type of business, how long they've been trading, what their sort of position is in terms of trading. Are they kind of brand new? Are they trading well? Are they in difficulty? Are they looking to be sold? All of those kind of different aspects. And then in most businesses, if you're talking about those with more than sort of a couple of people in them, the decision-making unit. So actually, who do you talk to and who actually makes the decision to kind of go and act, buy services or do other things? And then ultimately the sort of markets that they operate in. So where are they trading? Again, not exhaustive, but you'll get the sense there that there's, a good number of facets of information you'll already have that you may not have fully recognized. The other part then, which I think is key in terms of building up the bits that are hopefully right on your sort of under your nose there, are extra bits of information that you may already have, but maybe you're not necessarily linking back to your individual customers and behavior. So I imagine most of you will be involved in social media in some fashion, and there are tools and packages that can help you kind of understand sentiment around social, but there's very simple levels of, how many people, which content they're looking at, how long are they staying involved with it, are they recommending it to friends, engaging, all of that kind of stuff. So that's, again, a really great source of insight and help you understand it. From a communication point of view, much as we talk a lot about a digital world, there's still plenty of things that happen in a more analog fashion, particularly in my world when I'm dealing with older consumers. So you may have people writing letters, you may have emails, you may have other inbound communication. Pre-COVID, you may even have had sort of face-to-face kind of activity. All of that, again, will give you a source in terms of what people are thinking and what you kind of know about them. Surveys. So some of you will be running satisfaction surveys or asking people for opinions on things. You may do that in a structured way. You may do it on an ad hoc fashion. And again, all of that is really powerful data in terms of what do people really think about where you're at. And then the other two, which I think are pretty obvious, but I think worth kind of highlighting from a sales performance, and if you're a repeat business, retention rates, well, actually how much they're buying, how often, when they're buying it, how long before they come back, all of that kind of stuff will tell you quite a bit about different people's needs and behavior. And then lastly, in terms of this area, web data. And for those of you who have some kind of reliance on the web, and I imagine in the last 3 months, that's pretty much all of us have had to get even more involved in that if you weren't previously. But actually, looking at your web data, there's tons in there. So if you use something like Google Analytics, there's loads of metrics in there ranging from quite complicated to basic. So your bounce rate, the level of people returning, how long people are staying, how many different pages they're going through to go and get there. All of that kind of good stuff will tell you a lot if you split that back down. And so what I'd urge you to do at this point is really to work through that list, because I've given you some examples there, but actually you'll have lots more than you think, and you may not necessarily be linking that back up to what I just shared in the slide before in terms of your view of who they are. And then I think as we sort of build it through, we start to think a little bit more about some of the softer measures. And depending on the nature of your business, this can either be a much bigger priority or may in fact be a slightly lower. But I think it's important to think about that in terms of all of your consumers, or at least putting yourself through these questions, because actually characteristics wise, you could have two businesses or people that look very similar, but they've got very, very different attitudes and at the different kind of stages, then things will be very different. So, what are those consumers' priorities? What are their hopes, dreams, wishes? What are the things that they're worried about? What are their fears? I mean, there's obviously been a lot of that lately, and some of them are quite well placed. What really gets their attention outside of the stuff that you're doing? What's kind of really motivating them? And then from a composition of household or business makeup, actually, where are they? So, if you're, I don't know, in your 30s or 40s and you've got children, potentially grandchildren, parents, grandparents, actually, you've got quite a lot of influence in terms of that. So actually, what does that look like in terms of that composition? What's their sort of wider spend level? So actually, what are they spending with you and what are they spending elsewhere? What are their interests and hobbies? And I'll touch a little bit on that later on, because I think it's almost what else is important to them, what else are they bothered about in their life, what else is happening externally. And at the moment, there's some pretty obvious things that have impacted us all a lot, but there's sort of things that filter off that are key. And then what I would sort of term as sort of life stage. So actually, depending on kind of where you are on your journey, either as a person or as a business, what does that kind of impact? If you're very close to retirement, then you'll have some level of needs, requirements, and priorities that are driven by that. If you're just starting out in work, you'll have some different ones, and all the way through. And similarly from a business, depending on kind of where you are in your journey with that. So I think we then kind of move into some of the sort of more challenging kind of question parts. So this is an area I always kind of talk to clients and ask them to think about. So actually, what do your customers really think about your business, and where do you sort of fit into their sort of needs and wants? So are you a sort of discretionary purchase? And again, up until very recently, I talked a lot about travel or leisure, so stuff that you don't have to spend money on that you really enjoy, for example. Are you a sort of necessary but not necessarily exciting offering? And I'll use financial services. I think I can say that as someone who spent a lot of time in there. Not many people kind of wake up in the morning thinking today's the day I've got to go and sort my pension out, or I've got to go and arrange a remortgage. It's more a sort of necessary evil or something you've got to go and do. You can still feel good about it in some ways, but it's not something you're skipping for joy. And then actually from a sort of servicing kind of point of view, well, do you sell your service and talk to them and communicate with them in the way that they want? And at a crude level, that's online, offline, but it can be around the hours that you're available, how you kind of make yourself available for customer service kind of queries, and any other form. So what else would they be liking and be expecting from you? And then from there, I think hopefully you've now kind of got a view in terms of the core elements that you'd understood, areas that maybe you knew a little bit about but didn't act on previously, and then you're kind of working it through. So really of all that, and again in most businesses, people have generally got some kind of questions, concerns, sort of theories. Have you got a big question? So is there something that you would really like to know? Is it what your customers really think about you? So what do they like best about your service and dealing with you? Is it what is stopping people that you think you could have as customers dealing with you, and what that main factor might be, or factors? And who exactly are your competitors, and how do you stack up against them? So is there something in there that you've got a bit of an answer to, but you need to go and get into in detail? And then what I think is a really crucial point, which is when it comes to sort of your customers, there's always two bits. So I think many of us will get survey upon survey in terms of this sort of, how satisfied were you with your last interaction with the cash machine, or whatever else you've done. And those can sometimes be a bit frustrating, but they're very well intended to kind of work out what people think about different areas. And I think for a small business, I think it's really important to think about, would your customer recommend you? But actually beyond that, almost what would they say about you? So if they were, being asked in the cafe, assuming you can get back out to a cafe now, how would they describe your business and the interaction? And then think about that against what you'd like them to say, because sort of referral and reputation are key. But I think for that to be key, you need to really think about where are you at currently, and what you really like to be, and what you'd like customers and possible prospects to go and consider. So we're now kind of getting into the sort of middle part of the story, which is you've got quite a lot of information, a few kind of questions out there. So then let's start thinking about how we kind of meld some of that data together. So I think, as the good people in the X-File said, the truth is out there somewhere. So what I'd urge you to do is to pull together as much as you can of the first part. So in terms of what you know already, what you might have access to that you haven't really considered, and then really think hard about the second part. So in terms of the attitudes, behaviors, questions, areas you think might be blank. Now, depending on where you're on the edge of your business, you may well have plenty of information, and you might be able to start to do something with that right now. And if you have, great, go to the top of the class. You're in a position where you can start to segment your audience, or possibly refine whatever your segmentation is already. And I think what I'll try and give you here is a couple of little sort of examples. And again, I can't talk specifically about people that I've worked for, or current clients, but from a sort of behavioral point of view, there's typically a couple of things that kind of jump out. So in one industry I was lucky enough to work in, we did all the kind of analysis that I've talked about. And actually, when you dug back into it, it was the most important factor was buying behavior. And actually, because the product we were selling at that point was something that people bought on a pretty much weekly basis, it was very simple. If people's behavior started to change, then you knew things were altering. So actually, for key segments, it was really about working through what kind of offers, deals, how you could present products that could keep them interested and keep them coming back. And then equally in the leisure space and the holiday space, when I've done a couple of things from different clients, well, actually you had high instances of repeat business. And actually there was a point where once you'd been past a certain number of trips, you were incredibly likely, so massive multiplier difference to come back, as long as you were physically able to go and do it. So once you understand that, then actually how you price and present products and which ones you offer to people at different times kind of became quite easy and obvious, because actually you then had a much better longer term value that goes around that. So I thought, again, trying to kind of bring this to life a little bit further, what I do is kind of pick out some real life sort of highlights from cases that I've looked at. And again, I've tried to keep these relatively sort of high level. You can go as deep with these as you wish to go and look at. And these aren't all from the same place, but I've picked them as ones that hopefully kind of help illustrate my point. So if you're looking at your web data, so let's say you're looking at your Google Analytics, and you see really clear trends in terms of when visitors are coming to your site. And in this particular case, it was on Mondays and Fridays, and it was massively on Monday afternoons, so sort of 3 o'clock onwards, 3 till about 6, and then on Friday morning, so pretty much 9 till 11 or 12. I'd also spent a bit of time looking at surveys. So again, this is a business where we were doing quite a lot of talking to customers to go and get their opinions. And there was a really clear theme that came through from all the surveys over an extended period, which suggested that customers considered the offering to be pretty expensive, but really liked the quality, really thought it was high quality. And again, I've seen this in quite a lot of places, actually, the third point, and I think a lot of you will see this in your sort of businesses in different ways. So actually your social media sentiment tells you that people are feeling very cautious in the current climate. And cautious can mean lots of different things, but that's something, again, to be very aware in a situation that can be quite scary, both professionally and personally. Then there's looking at sort of sales data, so looking at that in a very simple level. And again, I've worked in businesses where you've seen, one product line suddenly rocket up and everything's looking lovely, and then a couple of others where they're absolutely sinking. So kind of what's driving that. And then finally, and again, I will come onto this a little bit more as we go through the presentation this morning, observing some really quite different behaviour from competitors. So in one of the travel markets I worked in, we noticed that there were a couple of key competitors really very obviously trying to attract a very different audience. And again, that was a kind of curiosity point around, well, actually, if they're trying to do that, what's kind of motivating that, and what can we pick out from there? So that's all interesting and lovely. I hear you cry or weep wherever you are, but what do I do about it? Because hearing and knowing that's fine, but if you've got a plan, you're going to struggle. So really, as we sort of move through this journey, what I'm saying now is what I would term as a hypothesis. So really, based on that feedback and having kind of pulled that information together, well, actually, what's that telling us? So if I take at some of those points individually and kind of what the insight and what the learning has been and what I think we want to go and do. So in terms of the product service value bit, if you're getting people think you're high quality, but they continue to be expensive, really making sure that all of your messaging, communication, customer service, pre and post sale, all of that stuff, you're just really kind of reinforcing your kind of core value and kind of why you're great, and probably focusing a little bit less on pure pricing, because that's not really kind of pressing buttons for that part of your audience. As far as the web traffic piece is concerned, it's really digging in. So it's looking and saying, actually, is that, you're sending your newsletter out, on a Monday morning and Thursday evening, and that's when people are kind of reacting to it, or is there something else? Interestingly, in the case that I quoted there, it had nothing to do with any form of marketing. It was very simply people going back into work and really not being that happy on a Monday. So they kind of made it through until sort of middle part of the day, and then we're itching to go and think about something more interesting. And again, on a Friday, very, very similar. It was just, coming up with the weekend, thinking about leisure time and how they spend it. And then in terms of the sort of understanding care points, well, that's, again, really key. And again, if you think about what we've experienced with the COVID pandemic, at the point things were starting to really kind of kick off in sort of mid-end March, but actually my inbox was suddenly filled up with all manner of sort of corporate emails from businesses telling me what they were doing about COVID, pretty much none of which I had any interest in at all, because it was just telling me how they were taking things carefully and sensibly and kind of covering things. And I think that's a really interesting kind of angle. And that's developed as we've kind of moved it through. But what I've found as we've kind of pushed along has been businesses starting to kind of understand the situation and be more sympathetic. And I got a particularly good email, I think it was from the Places Gyms guys, so the guys who kind of run some of the gyms that we've got in the local area. And I particularly enjoyed it because it just was a really clear and honest view of kind of, we're here at the moment, we can't reopen, here's the steps we've got to go through, if you've got opinions, kind of get in touch, and just laid everything out in a really clear fashion. Actually, some of the questions that I was at the point of going and raising with them, they'd kind of addressed in the notes. So actually they'd thought about what kind of communication they needed to share with people, and did it in a timely and sympathetic and empathetic kind of way. And then in terms of the competitor activity, well, again, that's an area that you can spend a lot of time kind of digging into, but at a basic level, it's really worth looking at, what are the areas they're changing. So if they've got an existing product and they're suddenly adding a different facet to it, if they've changed the product completely, what are they kind of going around it? Where are they advertising? What are they doing in terms of communication? What kind of language? In this particular case, it was holidays, and they were looking to attract a much younger audience than they had beforehand. I think with limited success, but you could see the attempt. And actually, in terms of the sort of testing part of it, which again I'll come on to talk to, actually you've got to have the theory and the view and to be able to execute it, and then to learn and improve it. So really kind of having come up with some of these kind of indications, it's important that you then start to think about actions and how you can either confirm or deny some of this thinking, because this isn't about coming up with a right answer. It's about looking at facts and information and then working out what you think is the best possible course of action that you can take based on what you know. So I think by now, hopefully we've got a pretty good and well-established kind of story. Now, depending on kind of where you are in your particular business journey, you may still have areas that are empty. You might be relatively new. You might be moving into a different area. There could be a whole range of things. And I think it's important to talk a bit about how you can supplement your data. So, there's loads of published data out there. And I think from a sort of simple basis, Mr. Google's always got something. So I think from a search point of view, I think I would urge you to go and spend some time looking at that. I think from a sort of size of market and opportunity and consumer behavior kind of piece, then the ONS data is generally a pretty good source. I think they're pretty active on Twitter in terms of kind of updating the reports that they produce, and then their site's generally a pretty excellent resource. And then there's networking and talking to people, or potentially, and I'm slightly biased as I say this, engaging an expert to help you out. And I think some of this stuff that I've talked about so far, and I'm going to come on to, a lot of businesses don't spend as much time as they could do, frankly, because it becomes quite hard. And actually, in a lot of cases, doing stuff and actioning things is kind of slightly easier, and people feel more comfortable because you think you're more likely to make a difference with that quickly. But again, I would just kind of urge you, and again, my sort of marketing experience and career has told me many times, having gone through a variety of different recessions over different periods, that sometimes investing a little bit of time and effort and potentially budget into looking at some of these more challenging areas may not seem cost effective immediately, but does pay back over the longer term. And actually, if you look at businesses that kind of grow and develop in a really great way, typically they've all got a really strong handle on their consumers and their motivations and what they want and how they interact. So in terms then of the sort of interpretation kind of part and pulling it together, I've given you a little bit of an example there, and I've talked about how important I think it is to kind of go and do it. But I think one of the bits that I would kind of urge you as a sort of top tip in this kind of place is to kind of park your opinions and concerns at the door when you're doing this. And that's why, again, I think it might be helpful to have some help from someone who isn't necessarily involved in the detail of your business, because sometimes you need someone to kind of look at things and kind of give you a pointer that's very hard to pull up when you're right into the nitty-gritty of it. And it can be uncomfortable in certain cases. And I've worked for a number of businesses where they were absolutely convinced their customer base was X. And then I did work in analysis and kind of confirmed that actually their base was more Z. And actually helping kind of people kind of get their heads around the fact that what they're doing actually had broader appeal than they were expecting was quite interesting. And I've done that a couple of times with older consumers, which is part of the reason I stepped into that space, where a lot of times people think that their audiences are younger and different to who they are. And actually, when you kind of dig in, life doesn't end at 50, doesn't end at 60, doesn't end at 70. And in fact, people have still got consumer needs and behaviors and are still doing it. And again, I've seen it work in businesses where I was looking at small business banking quite a while ago, and the business that I was working for at the time was very focused on attracting startups and very small businesses, so micro businesses. So a lot of the people that would have potentially started the chamber and kind of grown over time. And they had a sales force who were very focused on attracting much bigger businesses. So via this sort of process I've worked through, I was able to go back and present, well, actually, you've kind of got a bit of both, but really you're actually appealing to neither of those groups. You're actually appealing more to a sort of classic SME and more on the sort of M kind of part of it in terms of the medium-sized businesses. And that was really helpful because it meant that the sales team were able to be more focused and think more about the kind of businesses they were most likely to succeed with. And actually all of the sort of communication effort, comms, and the way in which we were servicing, they just sort of upped the game a little bit there on businesses that are a little bit larger rather than talk about it in different ways. And again, you'll have your own example that will go around that. So having got to this point now, so you've got hopefully got a great handle in terms of kind of who your customers are, what they're thinking, why they're thinking it. You've kind of worked out some sort of hypotheses around behaviors and things that maybe you're missing or areas for improvement. And this is where the we get to the sharp end. So actually in terms of what I would term as the fun part. So what are you going to do about it? So at a very simple level, once you've come up with your hypothesis or theories of kind of what you see and what you'd like to kind of go and do differently, you've got a chance to go and test this. Now, when it comes to testing, I would just have my 3 golden words are there of simple, 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 because I mean, talk a bit about digital testing because that's a quite specific discipline on its own. But if you try and kind of do something and you make it too complicated, you try and rush it, you try and make it harder than it need to be, you could end up getting yourself a very skewed result and actually making up a load of extra hard work for yourself, which isn't really what you're looking for. So my watchwords are simple here. So you need to be very controlled around what you're looking to test, and I'll touch a little bit about the kind of things that maybe you want to look at, but it's focusing on substantial items, things that if you were to make a change that you would really be able to go and do something with. Think about the period and when you want to go and run it, because running a load of tests in the middle of a pandemic, for example, may not necessarily be the best result for everything that you're doing. It might be, but it equally may not be. So think about when you want to go and do it. Dedicating plenty of time to review and measure, because if you're going to go and do something, you really should be spending as much time reviewing what you've done and really understanding it. And then there's a cultural point. So what I would term as rinse and repeat, which is that basically, testing isn't about kind of coming up with an idea, doing it once, and then that's the end of it. It's really iterative. And actually what you might find is that you've got a great idea. You may not be able to execute the answer to that straight away, but actually as long as you're kind of learning each time, you've got a great way of kind of improving it. And most great things in life and in business don't come right at the first strike. And if they do, they're generally pretty easy to kind of get swept away. So actually it's been really clear on that. So I think the bit to kind of have in your mind here is that learning is vital. Doesn't mean you sort of become non-commercial and go crazy. You've got to construct something that works for you and your business in the right way. But it's important that you kind of treat this as a sort of learning exercise. So in terms of sort of areas to test and how I'd suggest you kind of go and do it, as I said, I think I'd really focus on what I would term as sort of significant factors that will make a difference. So really kind of major parts. And I'd also suggest that you need to think a little bit about your sort of what I would term as a sort of control group or comparison kind of area. So actually, if you didn't run the test, what would the alteration be? And for those of you who've been involved in marketing, as I have, when you looked at sort of digital or direct marketing, quite often if you were sending a message out to people, then there's established ways of having a control group. So you basically hold a percentage of the people that you send your communication to out from that communication, so you can observe the behavior of better with and better without. And again, in your business, I'm sure there'll be equivalents of that, and you need to kind of work out how you do that in a sensible way. So if you think about sort of things you might test, they're pretty obvious. So I've called out my new markets, and again, I'm using consumers over 50. It could be any. It could be a different segment. It could be marketing to younger people. It could be a different geographical region. There could be a whole different range around it. It could be something even more basic. So actually, in terms of your opening hours, if you're in a physical location, it could be around the level of staffing you have available for sort of customer services at different kind of points. Actually, what difference does it make at different areas? It could even be making offers available at specific times and only via certain channels. And you see that a little bit with digital, where sometimes you kind of get a differential pricing on something because it's cheaper to go and service it. So all of those kind of areas might well be legitimate. And then having called out the example earlier on about sort of value versus price, well, actually, what is your kind of key facet? If you talk more about, different aspects of what you're offering, which part of it kind of works best for different consumers? And you'll see versions of this in lots of different areas. And then it can be even more sort of simple in terms of how often and when you communicate with different customers. If you send out newsletters, or you're putting out your social posts, or you're running online advertising, whatever it might be, it's actually when you do it, how do you do it, and sort of assessing that sort of frequency kind of part that goes around it. So from a sort of obvious point, I mean, there's a lot more that kind of get into, but hopefully I'll give you a little sense around some of the areas that would be useful to think about from a testing point of view. And again, many of you, depending on the nature of your business, might already be doing lots of this sort of stuff. And if you're very digitally focused, a lot of the tools within the Google suite will kind of do some of this sort of stuff for you straight away. So if you haven't yet, I think those are areas well worth kind of researching and thinking about what that might be able to do for you from an online perspective, but also in terms of how you might be able to take it in terms of the rest of your marketing. And then I think the final point I think I've really say there is just re-emphasizing my point around just give yourself enough time to think about the kind of things you want to test, how you set them up, and plenty of time in terms of the review and measurement, because ultimately if you're going to learn from something, you need to kind of give yourself time to let something play out and then really interpret it sensibly and correctly. I've seen the very opposite of that in many businesses, and it's a shame because actually it can inform wrong decisions or people missing out on great opportunities down the line. So that's the core of what I wanted to take you through. I think we're just about kind of on my timing. But what I wanted to do was to kind of just sort of reiterate, and by way of summary, what I think we've covered and areas for you to kind of go and take. So at a very simple level, it's really about looking at the sources of information you've got available. And when I say data, it could be anything in terms of how you kind of keep your records and how you've got it stored, but really think about what you know already in the natural course of doing what you're doing, and what you might have as a byproduct of trading, and see what you can do to pull it together. Really think about your gaps. So think about, is there information that you don't have which you'd really like to have, and start to think quite forensically about how you could fill those gaps. Really look at that data in a very systematic and logical fashion. And if you need help, then please go and get that from someone to go and do that in a sensible fashion. And then it's really about making the best decision on the facts that you have. So this isn't a time for sort of analysis paralysis, so to speak. This is really a great chance for you to look at your information based on what you've got and make the best call that you have, because there'll always be another bit of information and something else that can go and help you to go and cover it. And while some of this at some levels might seem quite hard, I'd urge you to stick with it, because from a performance point of view, it can be a differentiator. And the more that you really understand your customers and all the aspects, and it's full of view of what they think about you and what's going on in their lives, the better you'll be able to go and plan for them. And then in terms of testing, just sort of reiterate some of those points. As touched on, I think I would really plan on testing significant items I would talk about. And if you've got lots, you might need to sort of work through and prioritize those kind of areas, but I think that's really key. And then above all, it's that taking time to review, measure, and think about what you've done. And if you do that, you'll get yourself into a good place. So as I said, I'd use the phrase there, rinse and repeat. And actually, the very best businesses generally have some kind of culture of testing if it's appropriate to their marketplace. So that's kind of most of what I've got. Just wanted to kind of say, obviously, I'm Julian from Greyafro. I focus on over 50s, and I'm pretty active on all forms of social media under the name Greyafro, or LinkedIn under my own name. So if any of what you've heard today is of interest, or you'd like to kind of talk further, then you can find me on all of those different channels. So I'd just like to thank you very much indeed for listening. What I'd like to do, if you can bear with me, because I'm going to try and multitask, which is challenging for a man of my years. And if anyone's got any questions, please feel free to add them to the chat. So I'll just have a little review of what we might have in there, and I'll attempt to answer a couple of questions before closing up in maybe kind of 10, 15 minutes. And thank you very much. Okay, not many questions there so far. Let's have a little look here. Wondering where the Greyafro went. Yeah, Sadly, I really would like it back, to be quite honest. I'm kind of regretting it, really. I would have gone dreadlocks if I could have done, but I'll be getting divorced. Right, let's look. Okay, thank you, Richard. View on local marketing PPC. Okay, that's a good question. I think when it comes to local, and I suppose the sort of specific part of it, I guess I've got two views around it. And again, I think a little bit of that boils down to the nature of your business and what you're doing. So I think the question I always kind of pose to myself is, is my service dependent on offering something within a sort of key radius? So actually, is it something that I can kind of offer on a more broad basis? So just really challenging yourself, actually, should you do that and should you not? In terms of a kind of attraction for people, then yeah, I think as a channel to go and help, I think there's some good things that you can kind of go and do. And again, I see if you're a teacher, I think it's a route that you can kind of go and look at. But I do wonder whether actually, if you kind of take a step back in your chain and think about, who might be interested in English, there's an element of kind of search around it. But actually, I kind of wonder whether there's communities, groups, other local bodies that maybe you might be able to kind of go and talk to, that might be a route to help you kind of crack that nut. Because I think from a pure PPC point of view, once you kind of look at sort of auction kind of activity, things can kind of become difficult and challenging. I suspect also there, Richard, one of the things that could be of interest to you may be timing. So going back to my point around web traffic and where things kind of looked at, if you look back at your information or think about information that you've kind of had access to, is there anything that's a particular trigger? So I don't know, is it, on particular days of the week? Is it particular sort of seasonality? Are there points where people will be motivated to kind of go and do that? So if it's sort of English to students at school, well, actually, could it be something that you kind of position very closely to the start of the school is it the areas that I'd probably look at? Hopefully that's of some help to you. Now, Sue Towner, lovely, great to see you on board. So I'm in the grey or really white-haired age group, trying to reach all ages with the new idea. Yeah, so I think in your case, Sue, and I've kind of obviously been witness to some of your magic sort of in person. I think for me, actually, in your space, I think there's less sort of from a sort of pure networking point of view would kind of jump out as a way to kind of go and understand it. It's really kind of it's the viral element. So it's actually, who do you know that can kind of share what you're doing, or what could you do for somebody that could go and cover it? Because I think actually in your particular space, the proof's in the pudding. So once you've kind of heard, preferably sort of firsthand, some of your work, it's pretty compelling and pretty exciting. So I think probably needs a bit more thought, actually, but I would suggest that would be quite an interesting way to kind of go and do it. And again, similar to my point with Richard, it'd be really saying, actually, if you think about who you've had success with, who you've had engagement with, who might be following and looking at the stuff you're doing on social media, who might be sharing it, who may have ever tried to commission you, I think if you kind of thrash through that data in more detail, I suspect that might give you a truth of a fashion and a way to kind of pull that data out and go and do something further with it. So that would be my counsel underneath that, I think. Okay, so I'll just give it a minute in case anyone else has got any kind of burning questions or kind of queries around this. I'll be happy to kind of answer it. Let me just make sure everyone can still see and hear me. Okay. Well, look, I don't think there's any further questions coming up, and that's hit the 45-minute mark, which is what I was hoping to. So I think I'll call that a day at that point. And just again, thank you very much indeed for your time. And if you have any queries or questions post this, then please do get in touch. And I really wish you the very best for the day and enjoy the next events. Thanks very much indeed.